2,500, 3,000 people are not going to be able to hold up much against bureaucracies and political power that represents millions. They didn't have any power or influence on whether they could stop this or change it or anything else.
Boston is going to get what Boston wants.
I am George Boynton, formerly from Enfield. I was born in 1898 in the town of Enfield. And I graduated at grammar school at 1913. We had a box shop in Enfield, and we had a shoddy mill. They made a cheaper grade of cloth there. In Smith's Village, which was a part of Enfield, was a woolen mill where they made very fine worsteds. Most of the people in Enfield were farmers. We raised enough vegetables and provided beef and pork for the family for the winter.
This is a very quiet, very rural, very underpopulated part of Massachusetts, even back at the turn of the 20th century, when they first started talking about the idea of creating Quabbin Reservoir. It had very small populations. It was mostly farmers and small craftsmen.
You had the railroad running through the valley between Athol here and Springfield, and that was a major route for people going out of the area. The manufacturing had declined for several decades, so by the 1920s there were only a few factories left running in the valley. Boston grew both in territory and in population quite strongly. That did put quite a strain on their existing supplies and caused them, it seems, about every 20 years or 2 decades or so to have to go out and get some more water, get new water supplies. Boston, of course, is on the seacoast, and you can't drink salt water. Very early on, the Charles and Mystic rivers, which would have been natural sources for Boston to get water, were built upon and polluted by the various residents. So they started with a well in the 1600s, and then looked at various potential water sources for what we would now call metropolitan Boston, not just the city itself. And this recommended the solution that became known as the Wachusett Reservoir. In some ways, Wachusett Reservoir was a rehearsal for the Quabbin because it was built by a separate agency as opposed to a city. You have a large area where people are having to be removed, and not only the buildings torn down, but trees, even the topsoil removed. In 1895, you can see they were already thinking of what ended up being done, 3 decades later.
Before the state even announced it was taking the land, when it just started surveying the land, their lives changed profoundly.
We went up to the top, Mom and Pa and I, up the top of the mountain, and he looked down on the twinkling little village, lights all twinkling, Greenwich. In those places. Pa looked down and he said, "Oh, look at that beautiful place." Now he says, "I understand someday we're going to have a very vast park here." Park, mind you. Not a thing had ever been said to my Pa or anybody that I knew around here that there was going to be a reservoir, just a park. Well, you just shouldn't live in a park if it's going to be just that.
When I was a boy, up in the district school in Chaffee District, a man went by one day with a horse and buggy with 2 5-gallon glass jugs in the back of the buggy. We were inquisitive and know what he had in the bottles and the jugs. And our teacher, which was Fanny Garvin from Smith's Village, told us that for many years before this, that they had planned to take the whole valley as a reservoir to supply Boston with water. And they had been over to the west branch of the Swift River and gathered 2 jugs, which they did every 2 or 3 months to send to Boston to be analyzed to see if the water was pure, which really was. You could drink right out of the river.
By the beginning of the 20th century, there were very, very strong rumors that the state was going to take some of the towns for the reservoir. That, basically put put a real stop to any growth in the area.
And then people did say, well, gee, should I paint my house? Should I put on a new roof? Or, I mean, are they going to take this, or is it going to take a long time, or what?
They didn't spend any money, only what they had to maintain the houses, like shingles and things like that were necessary. Mm-hmm. No building or construction went on for a number of years.
Goodnow was the chief sanitary engineer for the State Board, later Department of Public Health, and he also was a fisherman, and he noted the fishing qualities of the Swift River, its various branches, and probably like a typical engineer, not just enjoying the fishing, but this is like a good place for a reservoir, looking at the high hills around the river valley. In his capacity as the chief engineer for this joint board report, which was issued in 1922, he recommended most of what became the project. It was called the Goodnow Plan after him. One of the first things they seemed to be working right off the bat was to flood the Swift River Valley for a reservoir. A number of different groups opposed the Goodnow Plan. The Boston area people, because they thought it was too expensive. Mill owners downstream from these places, because they thought they were taking too much water. Valley people, because they didn't want to be moved out. Another engineer was hired, Alan Hazen, and another committee set up to investigate this, and they issued their report in late 1925, known as the Gow Plan, after the chairman of the commission. It suggested other rivers and streams, like the Assabet River or the Ipswich River, to be considered for tapping for water supplies. But Gow was not, I don't think he was a very strong personality, so that he didn't really strenuously back the plan that was issued under his name. Engineer Goodnow managed to marshal some of his fellow engineers and his political allies to get this shot down as not being a practical enough solution or a long-term solution. Because of the sort of a deadlock in the legislature, it was recommended that Governor Fuller appoint a sort of a group of advisors or consultants to recommend a solution to this water supply logjam. And probably due to X.H. Goodnow's influence, not only Goodnow himself, but some of his allies were appointed to this committee. So it was kind of a done deal, and that they were going to pretty much recommend Goodnow's plan. And the governor said, okay, well, this is the recommendation of this committee I appointed, so why don't you guys in the legislature pass this and let's get it over with. So in the spring of 1926, the Metropolitan District Water Supply Commission was created, and it was tasked with doing a diversion of the Ware River, and it was also tasked with creating the legislation known as the Swift River Act, which was passed in 1927, a year later, to create what became the Quabbin Reservoir. Each one of those towns had a lawyer, they call them a town council, to help represent them on legal matters. They had a few hearings in the valley, or they sometimes went to hearings in Boston, and they would try to advocate for a quick solution to this whole issue, so people's lives weren't left hanging any longer than necessary, and B, trying to get some sort of reasonably fair compensation provisions put in for them. They were realistic people. They knew the numbers were against them, and that's why they didn't really figure it was worth spending much time, effort, or money to put up any major fight.
Well, they had many meetings, and they had representatives from Boston to try to smooth things over, and well, they were going to take it anyway. That was what everybody thought, so why fight it too much? You couldn't do much about it. All you wanted was a reasonable settlement and a reasonable length of time to vacate, which was granted.
They kept the taxes so low here, the land would be no value. So if they could buy it all up, no value. But they ran into me. I went up to court and let my own case on the Constitution. Judge Giles got up 5 minutes after I'd gone, and I guess he gave that mess of men there the biggest plea you ever heard to pay me my damages. That wasn't enough. They didn't do a thing.
Bun Doubleday, he was a Quabbin survivor, Bun was. His father had owned a grocery store in Dana. And his father was in his 40s when they began building the reservoir. Bun Doubleday would say to me about his father that, he was just devastated. He was full of fear. And he never did have another job in his life. They came, they took his store, they paid him money, compensated him, but the compensation was what he thought was far below the value of the store, and more importantly, there were no jobs for him after that.
We had to move from Enfield in 1934, and we settled here in Ware. And my mother lived a couple of years, and I guess her early death could be contributed to the fact that she was just uprooted in our old home, which had lived there for over 50 years.
Not all, but quite a few of the younger people thought this was an opportunity to get out of this kind of dying, old-fashioned, slow valley, even if it was to moving to just the larger towns like Athol here, or Orange to the north, or Ware and Palmer to the south, where you had more opportunities for different kinds of work. There were more exciting things to do, more activities, movie theaters and dance halls and things like that. Although a lot of the people who I talked to who had moved out when they were younger and thought it was kind of interesting to leave, later when they got old and they wanted to go, they couldn't go back. So then they started getting mad about thinking that their childhood was ripped away from them.
Eleanor Schmidt, who helped me tremendously too in the 1980s, 1990s, and she was still devastated. But a tear to her eye when she talked about it. You know, she'd say that, you know, most people can go home and visit their places where they grew up. She said, I can't do that. I just go down, I stand on the shore and I look out and at the water, and my home is underwater. I have no I have no home. I have no way to ever go home.
Among the things that people were most happy about was the Quabbin Cemetery, which they bought a plot of land in Ware, and they made a cemetery large enough to take all the bodies in all of the towns in the flooded area. They not only moved the bodies, but the monuments and everything that went with it.